Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual discussion of author Dylan James Quarles' There Be Monsters. We have Dylan here today to talk about their book with us, and we also have copies of There Be Monsters here in Orca Books as well. And I'll put a link in the chat box if you'd like to order a copy. But I'm going to begin with just a short summary of the text, and then I will hand the floor over to Dylan. And thank you so much for being here with us today, Dylan.
Thank you for hosting me. This is wonderful.
All right. The year is 1520. Jonah Monday and his crew of adventurers set sail for the New World on a quest to find a mysterious island in a lost city of gold. Unbeknownst to them, government scientists in the year 1985 are about to conduct an outlandish experiment which will tear the fabric of space-time and unleash unspeakable terrors upon Jonah and his crew. In the ensuing fallout, survivors, both past and future, must face monsters of their own making in a battle to undo the damage of the experiment and set right what once went wrong. All right, and a gentle reminder to keep your mics muted. And Dylan, I will pass the floor over to you.
All right. I'm going to read from chapters 13 and 14 because I think it gives a nice cross-section of things to come. In the hours following the storm, an eerie silence gripped the Resolution. No sound could be heard above the whisper of the sea. Chained in the damp, dark deepness of the bilges, Owen strained his ears and listened for the approach of boots. Soon, he feared, Cesare would appear, intent on extracting answers from him. Owen had seen the effects of the Italians' interrogation tactics, heard the anguished screams of those on the receiving end. A shiver ran up his spine, cold despite the smothering humidity which had swathed the ship. There was a rustle of movement, and Owen gave a start. However, with the clink of chains, his fear receded. It was merely someone shifting in the murk beside him, one of his fellow prisoners. Of those men who had tried to take the ship with him, only 4 now remained in possession of their lives and limbs. The rest were either dead or so near to it that the captain had seen fit to let them spend their final hours above deck, staring up at the stars. The unlucky survivors, known as Flea, Hellas, Capper, and Bean, had only escaped the butchery through the advent of the cosmic shockwave. Now they hunkered nearby, shackled to the same run of chains as Owen. The Irishman buried his face in his hands and wept. His plans were in ruins, and he had been soundly beaten. Despite all he had done to avert it, Martine's Island would be gained by the next day. Half wishing Jonah had let him fall overboard, he cursed the young man's name. His best hope now was that the New World would do what he could not, kill Jonah Monday. Half clinging to the wheel, half resting against it, Captain Christian Nelson pointed the bow of his beleaguered caravel in the direction of land. Torn, burned, and tattered, the sails did little to propel the ship through the night, yet the seas were calm enough to drift upon. Though not a biblical man, Nelson was nonetheless reminded of the first dawn after God's mighty flood. Then as now, the world seemed at peace. However, still faint against the purple void of space, the outline of the rift warned that their trials were far from over. Shifting his gaze to something more earthly and comprehensible, Nelson studied the deck below. There, laid out in even rows, the last of the dying hangmen groaned and writhed in pain. Tending to their needs, Jonah moved among them with a bottle of powerful spirits. Not 5 hours earlier, Nelson had seen him attack these same men with the ferocity of a lion. Now he was as tender as a lamb. Like his father, the boy was proving more complex than his pedigree would suggest. Mounting the stairs together, Fletcher and Cesare came to join the captain beside the wheel. "I'm in," he said, offering his hand in turn. "How fares Hans?" The two exchanged uneasy glances. "Well," began Fletcher, "to be totally honest, I don't know, Captain. I plied him with that poppy wine Kali brews, the one that makes you numb to the world. He drank the entire bottle and hardly seemed different. He's sleeping in the stateroom now, but I fear how he'll be when he wakes." Nodding, the captain flashed back to the moment of Casper's fall. In his mind, he heard the young man's body breaking as it struck the deck, and saw the look of disbelief on his twin brother's face. You're not alone, he sighed. I too dread tomorrow. Caspar and Hans were more than brothers. They were singular, two halves of the same entity. Now that one is dead, I won't be surprised if the other follows suit. Then again, after today, nothing can surprise me ever again. Fletcher grunted his agreement while Cesare remained silent. What should I do about Jonah? Asked the captain at length. He is our benefactor, yet he disobeyed an order. To save my life, said Cesare, and yours. You are right, nodded Nelson. He did save my life. You, on the other hand, I'm not so sure. You look quite well for a man who was stabbed repeatedly, if I might be so bold. Cesare folded his arms across his chest and said nothing. Dressing in black is a good way to hide the blood, Cesare. But as I told you before, it is my duty to know the men who sail on my ship. Jonah has shown that he will put personal motives above all else. Does that remind you of anyone? A dangerous shadow passed behind the old Italian's eyes, and Nelson wondered if he had gone too far. I'll speak with him, said Cesare at length. That is not your job, countered Nelson. I will talk to him. I am his captain. You are but his lackey. An awkward silence befell the scene, and the three men watched as Jonah knelt beside a freshly expired corpse to close its eyes. Exhausted beyond measure, Jonah moved down the rows of dead and dying men. Offering kindness where it helped and prayer where kindness would not suffice, he made his way from stem to stern. When he reached the end, he found that he had not the fortitude to double back for another pass. Many of those maimed and murdered had been left so by the cutting edge of his blade. He was responsible for their miserable fates, a killer with literal blood on his hands. In the wake of the fight, an ocean of guilt had flooded in to fill his soul. Jonah wiped his palms vigorously against the thighs of his breeches, but the stains of murder would not come off. Hot bile rose in the back of his throat, and he staggered to the port side bulwark to retch over the side of the ship. When his guilt could purge no more, he raised his eyes and peered into the darkness ahead. Despite the moonless night, Martine's Island could yet be seen. Soon, Jonah would set foot upon the shores of a new world, a land unknown to anyone. There, perhaps, he could wash away the sins of his past and build a better, more honorable future. Taking a deep breath, Jonah held it in his lungs. A little ways off, Kali sat beside the covered body of Caspar, whispering strange words in a language Jonah did not know. Curious, he put his back to the sea and studied the worldly mystic. Kali tapped his fingers in sequence and painted looping patterns on the white sheet which covered the body. Do you require something of me, young master? He said, ceasing his muttering mantra to meet Jonah's eye. Oh, blinked Jonah, forgive me. Extreme fatigue has rendered me ignorant of common courtesy. I did not mean to stare. It's quite all right, smiled Kali. This day has extracted a heavy toll on us all. Would you like to sit with me while I work? Jonah hesitated, then nodded. What exactly are you doing? He asked. Kali rested a hand upon Caspar's corpse. I am attempting to guide poor Caspar's ghost to the edge of the great divide. I sense that he died with much left to accomplish. As such, he may linger. I see, said Jonah. And is that a skill you learned from your former master, the high priest? It is. If you wouldn't mind, Jonah ventured, would you please tell me what language you were praying in? It begins like Greek. Then just when I think I have it, I hear echoes of Hebrew, even Parthian. Kali chuckled. It has many names now, young master, he said. Balal, Enochian, Babel. He let this last word trail into the breeze. It is the first tongue, the root of every language spoken today. Exhaling a tight breath, Jonah returned his gaze to the ocean. Mirrored in perfect detail, the night sky undulated and rippled before him. Like a falling star captured in time, the rift flickered with motion. Babel, he grunted, from Genesis, yes? I know the story well. Men working together on a grand vision, all of them speaking the same language. No miscommunication, no insults, no slights, no lies or murder. He cast a hooded glance over his shoulder. A utopia destroyed by a jealous and distant god, his seeds of confusion forever returning bloody harvests. Kali assumed a contemplative expression. Yes, he said after a pause. You know the story well, yet that is all you know. A story. Smiling tiredly, Jonah nodded. Please, friend, keep me not in suspense. What is the truth? The truth, began Kali, is that Babel was not taken from us, but given. It was a gift, young master, bestowed upon us the day the gods arrived on this world. What later became of it, the fracturing and ruin, that we did ourselves. Jonah furrowed his brow, secretly happy to have such a conversation to distract him. Do not most faiths agree that some god or other created the world, not simply paid it a visit, as you imply? Most, conceded Kali, but not all. Jonah's brow furrowed deeper. Where I was educated, smiled Kali, we were taught that the gods are but travelers, explorers from the unknown. They have visited our world throughout the ages, many different races of them, but they did not create us. We are like them, only different. Processing this as best he could, Jonah studied the rift. Just visible within its glowing dimensions, foreign stars could be seen. Does what I say surprise you? Asked Kali. The truth can sometimes have that effect. Jonah shook his head and pulled his gaze to the distant outline of Martine's island. No, he said, it does not surprise me. After all, who are we but explorers? And what are we doing at this very moment if not bearing down upon an unknown world? I suppose the real surprise will come when we meet the waiting inhabitants and learn if it is we who are the gods or they. Chapter 14, Location Unknown, Date Unknown. Weak in the failing glow of the auxiliary lighting, a maze of corridors wound their way through the body of the shipwrecked Rotterdam. Resting at an odd angle upon the rocks, it shifted with each swell and wave. From the lower decks, the sounds of violence could be heard, gunshots, screams, and roars echoing up the stairwells. It had been 3 days since the detonation of the 15-kiloton payload, and in that time, all hell had broken loose. Bleeding and pale, Sergeant Mike Declan leaned on his shotgun like a cane and tried to keep up. Ahead, Willa Waterhouse led the way, picking a path through the bodies and bullet casings. A wave struck the ship, and Declan stumbled, feeling the gash across his stomach tear open a little wider. Still unable to believe what had caused the wound, he wondered if perhaps he was suffering from shock. And yet, try as he might to convince himself that he had not seen what he thought he'd seen, a vision of black tentacles and blood-soaked teeth remained in his mind. As if someone had cut the power to his legs, they went numb, and he fell to the ground. Damn it, Declan, said Willa, coming back for him. Get up. We have to keep moving. It's not far now. He grunted, overcome with pain. I can't. She kicked him, not hard, but hard enough to make her point. Knock it off and get the hell up. I'm not fucking around. Cries of terror and anguish tore down the passageway. Willa cast a look in their direction. You hear that? She hissed. It just cleared the lower deck. It'll be here any minute. We have to try and get out while we can. Exhausted as he was, Declan hated to see Willa so afraid. Mustering every ounce of strength he had, he took her hand and staggered back to his feet. They made it another 10 paces before he crumpled again. Just leave me, he heaved, starting to shiver despite the heat. I'm fucked, and it's slowing you down. Shut your damn mouth, she snapped, and get back up. She pulled, exercising her considerable strength. Declan found his feet once more, but it was short-lived. The second Willa let go of him, he stumbled sidelong into an open cabin and collapsed against the hard metal bed frame. Declan, shouted Willa, please. You were right, he said, shaking his head. I should have listened to you earlier. I'm sorry, Willa. I'm sorry. Coming into the cabin, she grasped him by the arm and tugged, but there was too much blood, and her hands kept slipping. Willa, he said, baby, shut up, she ordered. Shut up and stop talking like that. We can still make it, but you've got to get up. Declan gazed up at her, impressed beyond measure. Despite the dim glow of the cabin lights, her eyes were like blazing coals, full of vitality and heat. Next, he looked down at himself and swooned, not recognizing the heap that was his body. Kruger's creation, whatever it was, had done a serious number on him. In the middle distance, the rattle of a submachine gun snarled to life, only to be silenced with a scream. Willa went to the hatchway and peeked out. What are those things? Whispered Declan. What was Kruger doing down there? He thought of his men, saw their terrified faces lit by the strobing light of their flashing gun barrels. Torres, he groaned, his wife just had a baby. And Sinkovitz, did you see what it did to him? What it did to me? Michael, said Willa, using his full name. I need you to stay focused. Look here, look at me. We're close to the rear starboard hatch. We can still make it out. And go where? The sky's ripped open. We don't even know where we are. Another eruption of violence sounded nearby, and this time it was on their deck. There's an island, said Willa. I saw it on one of the monitors before we lost power. We can swim to it, and, unable to help himself, Declan lurched with painful laughter. He loved Willa's optimism, her can-do attitude. It was what had first attracted him to her. What? She frowned. Why are you laughing at me? What's so fucking funny? Sweeping a hand across himself, Declan gestured to his blood-soaked jumpsuit. Here and there, tears in the fabric revealed oozing wounds beneath. I'm not swimming anywhere, Waterhouse. Look at me. It's all I can do to keep my guts from spilling out. I'm fucked, baby. You know it and I know it. You've got to go. Just leave me here. He looked around the cabin, taking it all in. It was sparsely decorated, probably belonging to a sailor based on the books and crudely hung nudie pictures on the wall. All in all, not a bad place to die. It's over, baby, he sighed. I'm done. Before Willa could argue, he thrust his shotgun at her, then dug in his pocket for shells. Take this and take these. They're DU rounds, depleted uranium. Seems to slow those things down better than hollow points. Go figure. Michael, said Willa haltingly. Hush. It's okay, really it is. I'm just tired, you know? Besides, I like it in here. Threatening to fill with tears, Willa's eyes found his. What about you? She said. I can't just leave you for those things to... Mike Declan ain't nobody's dinner, you hear me? He reached into another pocket and drew out a knobby-looking frag grenade. Michael, gasped Willa. No, shut up, he groaned. I'm doing it. End of discussion. Pursing her lips so tightly it looked painful, Willa crouched before him and put a hand on Declan's cheek. Her touch warmed him, even with the blood loss. I'm doing it, he repeated. I'm doing it. She heaved a heavy breath, almost a sob. I think I love you, you crazy son of a bitch, she sniffed. Yeah? Yeah. A series of muted pops, followed by a peal of agonized shrieks, chased down the passageway. Time to go, said Declan, brushing Willa's hand from his cheek. See you in another life, babe. With unimaginable inner strength, Willa nodded and stood up. Gathering herself, she went to the hatch, then lingered. Silhouetted against the dying lights, she cast one last look over her shoulder, then vanished into the body-strewn passageway. Declan leaned his head back against the bed frame and waited. Seeping from his wounds, blood pooled on the floor around him. Half worried that he would expire before Kruger's monster found him, he considered calling out and making noise. So heavy were his limbs that even the thought of this exhausted him. The room began to fade, dampening around the edges. Something was moving in the passageway, the clatter of claws on metal. Forcing his eyes back open, Mike Declan pulled the pin from the grenade and sat up straighter. I'm in here, you piece of shit, he growled. Dinner is served.
Awesome. Thank you so much for reading that for us.
My
Welcome to
pleasure.
everyone who joins. Thank you again so much for being here with us today. Just to start off, I just wanted to ask, like, what inspired you to write There Be Monsters, and what was your writing process like? Was it like specific? Do you have like a writing process that's for all your projects, or was there something specific for There Be Monsters?
I'll answer the first part and then I'll segue into the second. So I was inspired to write There Be Monsters. I'm inspired to write most things. Most of my stories come from folklore or urban legends or conspiracy theories, and that's a dirty word now, but I'm like an old school conspiracy theorist, like UFOs, not, stolen elections and all this nonsense. So for me, with There Be Monsters, the original kernel, and it actually connects to the chapter there, is the urban legend of the Philadelphia experiment, which was this supposed experiment that took place where, using like Nikola Tesla's technology, the Navy made a battleship. They were trying to cloak it, according to the legend, make it invisible. And what ended up happening, according to the story, is that it teleported to somewhere else, and then it came back a few minutes later, and the crew were like dazed and confused, and some of them were like fused into the bulkheads, and it was like this whole, whoa, what happened? So my imagination was immediately like, well, where did it go? in this time, between when it disappeared and reappeared. And of course, there's like no merit to the story at all, but that doesn't matter for me because I'm writing fiction anyway. So it just seemed like a nice uh it all spun out from there. It all started from there. And I knew the 1520s part of the story, and that whole concept was born of my intense love of the Count of Monte Cristo and the way that Dumas would pack that story with so many other stories. So I had this idea for this Navy experiment, and there's already a movie, a Philadelphia experiment movie. It's not good, but it exists. So it's like, well, I can't just directly do the Philadelphia experiment. I have to kind of like take pieces of it and then pay tribute to Dumas in my like clumsy ham-fisted way and sort of just like marry the two. I also was excited to really challenge myself with putting together a novel that's made up of so many other pieces. Like Connor, my publisher, calls it a chimera. I think of it as a Frankenstein. It's a lot of different pieces of things put together. And actually, a former employee of your wonderful store said it shouldn't work, but it does. And that was like the best compliment I could have been paid. As far as my writing process is concerned, I did approach it in the way I approach all of my projects. And I'm actually going to be, this is a shameless plug, I'm going to be running a workshop through Imprint Books in Port Townsend in May. And it's about this process that I have, which is the way I plot my books is I think of a few set pieces that I just let my imagination sort of go where it goes. And I then try to determine, okay, what I just sort of saw in my head, this little movie, whatever, this scene, where do I think that fits in the overall sort of timeline of my story? And then I know when I'm writing what I'm working toward. So if I have like, I had like an idea for the mutiny, like sort of early on. So I'm like, okay, I know there's going to be a mutiny in this story. So I know I'll work toward it. I don't exactly know where it falls because I don't plot like so point by point by point. But I call them mile markers, and they just sort of give me something to work toward. And so this book had, and that's part of the chimera-iness or Frankenstein-iness, is I had like all these different random ideas for scenes, like, oh, what if there was a battleship that's being besieged by a monster? Well, how does that fit into a 1520s, we're sailing across the high seas to the New World with mutinies? Well, maybe we'll see if we can work some time travel into the story to make that work. And so that's kind of how it all sprung. But for more on that, check out that workshop in May.
Awesome, very cool. Thank you for sharing that. I love the idea of like setting the markers and like knowing the scenes that you're writing towards, and those mile markers kind of being like the inspiration that you then drive yourself towards. That's awesome.
And you don't have to be like married to it or like some, it's not my style, but I have heard of authors who are like, they're extremely careful in their plotting. And I do like to like be, a little, I'm a greener. I like to be able to like go with the flow, I like to see where something takes me. So just like having a vague idea of direction I'm heading in allows me to still, I won't say surprise myself, but it allows me to sort of still pull something out of a hat and see if it works.
Thank you. The story is introduced kind of as this adventure that's being passed down from Jonah's father as he's dying, and kind of like this adventure is tasked to his son, and then later on in the text there's like the discussion of like purpose and like a prophecy. They're following a prophecy. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about like the initial familial expectations that Jonah faces and how he responds to his calls to action.
Yeah, that's a good question, because initially when you first meet Jonah, he's actually sort of already bucking those familial expectations, or at least his perception of them. He's not like, he's this young nobleman and his dad is kind of a so-and-so, and the king is like a fan of his and entrusts him with these missions or whatever. But Jonah doesn't take part in that world. And there's something in the beginning of the book where it's like it pretty much lays out that he's a humanist. It has that movement hasn't totally become what we will later call the Renaissance, but it's sort of in that vein. And so it's like he's already sort of like bucking what he thinks is his familial responsibility. But then as the story progresses and he begins to learn things about his father that he never knew, because his father was sort of a mystery to him his whole life, he's like realizing that, a lot of that was just his own sort of ideas about what he thought his father wanted from him. But the more he gets to know his father through all of the members of the crew that sailed with his father for so long, and learns about this sort of secret life his dad had, that sort of torch passing actually does become more direct, because he then becomes like his father, this like adventurer, this driven humanist. So I just thought it was interesting, like the idea of getting to know somebody after they're already gone, through their friends and through the stories their friends tell. Because again, I'm paying homage to Dumas, so like the character Cesare is just full of stories about what Lord Monday got up to over here and over there, and half of it is like, is that bullshit or is that true? And but regardless, like Jonah is learning who his father is through that, and then other things that I don't think I'll spoil here, other family drama that does crop up in the story, helps him kind of assume that mantle, even though he didn't realize that it was the mantle he was meant to assume.
Awesome, thank you for that. And I'll avoid spoilers as well, but you brought up Cesare, who is such a phenomenally interesting character. And without going too deep into it, early on you begin hinting towards something in regards to Cesare's character, right? And you're hinting and you're dropping hints, and it wasn't until like the second or third time did I click like, oh, I ought to be processing this. I better be making notes as that's coming up for Cesare. And yeah, can you talk a little bit about when you're writing, when you do want to like drop those nuggets of information for the reader, and
Sure.
is it something that like kind of falls out of you, or are you intentionally leaving breadcrumbs for your readers?
Both. So with Cesare, that's one of those deals where I had all these ideas for scenes for him. I knew I wanted him to be this like really dark. I mean, he's loosely based on like Cesare Borgia, who was, one of the Borgias. But like there was this whole class of dudes back in the day in Italy around this time. They were called condottieri. They were like contract soldiers, and they were just really badass, like scary guys that you really didn't want to mess with. And so that was sort of what Cesare started as in my mind. And he does continue to be that throughout the story. But then I couldn't help myself. There are certain themes I return to again and again in my other work, like The Man from Rome. And so, if you've read that book, you could read between the lines. I'm fascinated with the idea of all different types of monsters. Like what is a monster? Is a monster something that's just unnatural? Is it a literal monster, like was in the scene I just read, eating all these guys? So like, I thought, well, what if Cesare is just a different kind of monster? And I started to look for opportunities to drop those breadcrumbs. And since he was already going to be this really like proactive, hands-on character in terms of like every time there's an action sequence, he's getting right into the middle of it. It made it super easy to just have those moments where, as the captain mentioned in the bit I read, I'm pretty sure I saw you get stabbed a few times, but you're walking around. You want to explain that? And oh no, anyway, moving on, and just kind of like keep teasing that out. But it's certainly born of the fact that I kind of can't help myself when it comes to some of these tropes. Like I'm always going to try to find a way to put somebody in a book that's a little bit like Cesare. Again, not trying to give away spoilers, but yeah.
Thank you. He was really fun to read because he does have that like mystique about him of just like you know something that I don't, and I want to know it, and you're never going to tell me, are you?
Yeah.
But he was a fun character. Do you have any favorite characters when you're writing, or are all?
I definitely do. Yeah. I know you're not, well, maybe you're not supposed to, maybe you are, but I do. I have characters that I'm like super invested in, And then I have characters that maybe like on the first or second draft, I'm not. But by the third draft, I see suddenly something clicks and they make, because like, every book is going through so many drafts. And I love like when I get into like the second draft, that's my favorite time to be a writer, because that's like all the hard work is done and now I just get to whittle away and polish and add those little breadcrumbs or drop hints. But I certainly favor some characters over others. Cesare was a character that I really was like, I want to get this character right, because he's similar to a character in another book that I wrote, The Man from Rome. And there are tie-ins. Like, I'm kind of low key, all my books sort of take place in the same universe, even if they are vastly different. Like The Ruins of Mars is straight up sci-fi, but there are mysterious alien orbs in the ruins of Mars that have all kinds of weird powers. And if you touch them, things happen to you and you can see things that you couldn't see before. And so it's like, I'm saying things without coming right out and saying it. But I've toyed with the idea of telling Amazon, like, yes, this is a prequel to the Ruins of Mars. It's not, but maybe it is. But with Cesare, I wanted to kind of like revisit some ideas I had for The Man from Rome, but I'd learned a lot since writing The Man from Rome. It's like, here's how I can refine this character and really make it sing. But like I said, it's all about who I feel needs to be served in that drafting process. There were characters that were kind of just there to, not, I won't say advance the plot, but they were there to help other characters have emotional realizations and advance their emotional arcs. But then by the time like the third draft rolled around, I suddenly was like seeing a side of them that I didn't see, and it was really easy to then just go in and flesh them out.
Thank you. So twice in the book, there are poems that appear, couplets that act as kind of like a time lapse. And the first time it appears as a sailor song. It's like right as Jonah is beginning the adventure and the sailors are singing about his father. And I loved it. I thought it was so smart when I read it. And I was so excited that I was kind of hearing like the mythology that the sailors themselves were building. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like the world building thematically and stylistically in your writing.
Well, I really appreciate that you picked up on that, because that bit of the book, like, okay, we've met our cast of characters more or less. Okay, Lord Monday is dead. Time for, we have the impassioned speech. We're going to go to the new world. We're going to follow this star map, yada, yada. That's the time in the book when it's like, now I'm going to spend, 2 paragraphs on each character and flesh them out and tell you who they are and where they fit, because you've just been introduced to them, but they haven't been fleshed out. And it's like, I've done that before. I did that in the Ruins of Mars. There was a whole passage of time, literally leaving Earth and going to Mars, where I was fleshing those characters out. So when I sat down to write this, I'm like, I'm not going to do that again. It's just too pedestrian. It's what you expect. So how about I play with the fact that, like, I got British characters. I have English characters. Shakespeare's a thing. Like, it's not a thing yet, but he will be. And we're kind of dealing with like, it's like a little fuzzy, the timeline, and I'm not too worried about it, because I do have like time travel and monsters. So it's like, everybody can just calm down. But I was like, well, this is a great opportunity to do all of that. I can literally tell you, and I know the rule is show don't tell, but it's really show and tell. I can tell you who these characters are. This guy, this is his job on the boat. This person, this is their job on the boat. This is what this person does. But do it in this like lyrical poem way so that it's fun. And I will tell you that it was a real pain in the arse to do that, because I've written a lot of songs, so I know about like using pentameter and syllables and all that stuff, but it still takes a long time, and I'm not a poet. So that bit of the book took me quite a while to get it done. But when it was finished, I was super happy with the results. And world building is super important, like you mentioned. It's really important, especially when um, I set a book in a period and I make attempts here and there to keep it legitimate, but it's riddled with anachronisms, and I know that. So it's like, then I have to pivot and I have to build a world wherein these anachronisms don't matter, because the tone and the sort of continuity that I create allows for them, so that it doesn't stop you in the middle of reading and saying, well, wait a minute, that doesn't work. Or, and that's the world building side of it. Like, some people think of world building as like literally telling the reader like, oh, well, this is the king and this is the lineage and the elves live over here and the dwarves live over there, and like really like literal world building. But to me, world building is about creating a continuity, so that you can take your story in places, or you can push the boundaries of believability, but your readers will say, oh, this all fits inside the established parameters of this world that you have built, you know? So I don't know. There's probably an answer in there somewhere.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I love it, and I really did appreciate that couplet scene, because it is so satisfying to read, and then it all pans out, like it has the cadence and the rhythm, and it matches as couplets. It's really awesome. But I was thinking about anachronisms, and it happens textually in the book, so it's not quite anachronism. But there's this scene where Willa is sharing a Twinkie with a character, and it was a scene that I think had like the most joy in like the book period. Like, it was so happy. I was smiling for like this man from the 1500s who had never had the opportunity to eat a Twinkie before.
Yeah.
And there's this line that you actually just read for us. Will kick someone not too hard, but hard enough to make her point, right? So there's these
Yeah.
really like mild moments of like comedic relief that like gives the reader like, okay, like I just caught my breath a little bit. Now there's going to be some tentacles in a little bit, and I'll be emotionally prepared for that.
Sure.
But and I was thinking about kind of like the connection that humor and horror has, just like within the canon of everything.
Oh
And
yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, about like how you work with humor when you write horror. Is there a connection for you?
For sure. I mean, I am a humorous guy. I like to laugh, and I think some people who know me would say that I'm serviceably funny. And I actually don't, I love horror. I like horror movies. I was late to the genre, weirdly. Like, I was a really scared little kid. And it wasn't until I was maybe in high school that I started to be like, okay, I can do this. Actually, I like it. Okay, I really like it. Maybe I like it too much. You got to dial it back a little bit. And I'm like that guy. I made a bunch of horror movies in college, but I'm a pretty big, I'm my own biggest critic, maybe not my own biggest critic, but I'm a critic of my work. And so sometimes I don't feel that I actually pull horror off well, like, because like I'm scared of everything in a weird way. Like, I'm an adult now and I can get over it, but I have like all these irrational fears, horror, that I think probably a lot of horror writers do. And that's why they're successful, because they can really like imagine it and really describe it because they are living it. Um, but it wasn't until Connor came on board with the project and read the pages that take place shortly after the Twinkie scene that you were mentioning, where he was like, that's a legitimate piece of horror writing. And like, that again lends itself to that kind of Frankensteininess of the book. Like, more or less, the book's like an adventure story, and there's some sci-fi and there's stuff going on. And then suddenly there's this scene when they all return to the Rotterdam and it's shipwrecked, and they're all together, and there are these dudes out of time, and they're being led by Willa, and the ship is just the scene of this terrible butchery, and it's the scene of this awful crime, and it's really macabre and dark, and they're moving through the ship, and there's all this really spooky stuff happening. And I had a blast writing it because I just like to use those words and that imagery. And then later Connor told me like, no, that's like effective horror writing. I thought, okay, cool. And after that, he pushed me to start trying to write more horror. And we have since begun collaborating on a series of short stories that are set in my hometown where I currently live and grew up, Port Townsend, about like their horror stories about Port Townsend, because Port Townsend's like full of ghost stories. It's got all these old Victorian mansions, it's got these military bunkers up in the hills and all this spooky stuff. And it was really the writing of that scene on board the Rotterdam and hearing from people that that was actually like a successful piece of horror writing, that I was like, okay, I think I can actually start dipping my toes in earnest into horror writing. But to answer your question, like the balance between horror and humor, I think it's, maybe Stephen King said this, and I'm not like the biggest Stephen King fan, no disrespect to people that are. I've read quite a bit of his work, but he said something in an interview after he directed that film Maximum Overdrive, which is objectively stupid and not scary. It's funny. It's so bad it's funny, but he tried to defend it in this sort of like coked up, he was very like spun out in this interview, and he was saying that people were laughing at the movie because horror and comedy are just right next to each other, and sometimes something is so scary all you can do is laugh, and that's why people were laughing at his bad movie. And it's like, that's not true about that movie, but I think he's actually right about horror and comedy. Like sometimes you have nothing left to do but laugh. And I think this is also why you see some actors who start out as comedians like Robin Williams, and then they super effectively and super easily slip right into the role of these spooky, horrific kind of psychological roles. I'm thinking like Insomnia or 1 Hour Photo. I don't, I'm like a movie nerd too, so I probably should cut that off.
No, it's all relevant. Yeah, it's I find that Stephen King bit quite funny because I do think there's a point like how they brush up against each other, and part of my curiosity is it like the absurdity and tragedy of horror, and I was thinking as I was reading like, well, what's the monster a metaphor for, right? Like, or is there a metaphor?
Right.
And what I sympathize with the characters with is it's kind of like relentless, like there's very little time for them to process what's happening before they are challenged to respond to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really smart how it's done, and even within that there are the characters that can respond with like just a smidgen more like of emotional intelligence. There's this scene between Willa and Owen when they're sharing where they're sharing emotions, and Owen's kind of asking Willa's like to act as confidant, and she kind of takes what he's going through and processes it for him, and then like feeds it back to him, and like, well, this is what's happening in your personal life, and this is maybe what you should do to move forward with
Sure.
yourself.
Yeah.
And I guess, can you touched on this a bit earlier, but I was wondering if you could like speak to your cast of characters and how they push each other along amid the chaos of the island of the Rotterdam.
Yeah, I think I've learned about myself that I work well with a cast of characters because they can do what you mentioned. They can process emotions. People do this for each other all the time. I have a huge group of friends online, and we are, it's amazing how often people help one another process emotions. And so the bigger the cast of characters I have, and it's like, okay, it's a fine line. I don't want to have too many because then that's just unruly. But there's like this sweet kind of Goldilocks zone, where you can have enough characters who come from enough different backgrounds, and they bring enough interesting sort of backstories that they can then be used to help one another process things, especially like if they are more suited for that than another character. And since it's fiction, you can sort of you can line things up as you need to have like a moment like you mentioned where Willa is sort of just like perfectly positioned to help Owen process his guilt and whatever, better than any of the other characters would be able to, because she's the character that's perfectly suited for that. I have a lot of admiration for writers who can write a story about one really strong character. I don't know how they do it. I think I'm not ADD, but I'm just too scatterbrained to dive that deep into somebody or even myself. Like I'm sure sometimes you writers that write about a really strong character, it's sort of just like it's like an amalgam of their own personality. But I like to spread things out a little bit, and especially helps with the whole like kind of Dumas side of things. Like if I have a big cast of characters, they can all have interesting backstories, and each one of them can have the opportunity to tell that backstory, and that can be a story inside the story, and kind of this whole like Russian doll of little stories inside one another. But I just have learned. I tried with my the novel before this one, The Man from Rome. I tried to do a smaller cast of characters, and parts of it were successful. Like I learned a lot. Connor's always telling me like that was a learning experience, and it was a learning experience. But one thing I definitely took away from it was that like when I'm looking forward to my next project, I'm going to do another fairly large cast of characters because that's where my strength is. And I know that I need a few people to pull on here to move things along or process things for one another in a way that feels like cathartic and natural.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I really do love how you write the dynamic between a large cast, because it is hard to balance, but you are pulling it off. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
The end of the novel kind of points to a more alien source for a lot of human mythologies. The characters are bringing references to Atlantis and Greek gods. And I was wondering, what kind of research do you do when you're writing about these mythologies?
Well, let's see. I have 3 copies of Edith Hamilton's mythology in this house. 2 of them are on the like the central bookshelf, you know. I've got numerous books on folklore and mythology. Hero with a Thousand Faces, one of my favorite books. I've listened to the Hero's Journey with Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyer, the conversations, seminal, amazing conversation between those two at Skywalker Ranch talking about the hero's journey. I've watched the show, the interview, and it's mythology is just one of these things that fascinates me to no end, especially the similarities between different mythologies isolated by thousands of miles or thousands of years. And I know that you can trace a lineage sometimes, like a passing down of a similar motif, but sometimes you can't account for the similarities between these mythologies. And Joseph Campbell said that there was 2 explanations that he could think of for why there were these similarities across the globe. One was that the stories were true, and the other was that people are just hardwired to think along these lines. They're hardwired to view their world through these motifs and create these stories to process them. And I love that explanation. But, and this is where I go a little bit into what I was mentioning earlier about like the harmless conspiracy theories. I also have a copy of Eric von Daniken's Chariot of the Gods in my house, and I read that in high school. And that is like the original ancient astronaut theorist book before Ancient Aliens went off and did its whole thing, and the guy with the hair and everything. I love it. Don't get me wrong. I put it on sometimes when I'm like doing dishes, just because it's where I get like ideas for outlandish shit in my stories. But I feel like he posits a third potential explanation for why there are these similarities across cultures. And it's just a neat idea, even if it's very shaky. And I just find endless joy in the idea that gods might be real, but they're not gods, you know. And that's mentioned, that's like right in that scene I read earlier, the idea like Kali is saying, you know, he comes from this mystery school, and so he's got his finger on the pulse of the secret history of the world and all that. But he's like, yeah, no, I mean, they're not gods, they're just travelers. They just come, they go, they get on their ships, and we say, well, look at that big flying chariot, because that's what we have words for. And I'm that's the thing that pops up a lot in my stories. Like the ruins of Mars is literally that. I mean, there's ruins on Mars. Oh my gosh, they're sort of similar to ones we have on Earth. What does that mean? Let's explore it for 3 books. The Man from Rome, it's dealing with immortals. Greek gods are characters in the stories. Diana is a character, Artemis, and yet it's really clearly stated in the novel, from some of these characters who are immortals, that they're not gods. They're just from somewhere else, and they came here a long time ago, and they've been here for a long time, and this space affords them certain, powers or whatnot, but they're not gods. And so, like, I grew up on the Trojan War. My dad read me the abridged Trojan War as a kid. That was like one of the things I remember, my earliest sort of literary deals. So I kind of can't help myself when I see an opportunity to be like, let's throw some Greek gods in there. And then maybe see if I can tie that to ancient aliens or whatever. I can't help myself. I'm like a kid in a candy store. I just got to do it. You got to do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And the way you opened that up, you kind of brought up truth, and it was making me think of this other scene, or it actually might be the same scene between Willa and Owen, but at one point she makes the observation, oh, the truth inspires you, which I thought was just a lovely sentence. Willa gets a lot of beautiful words in this book.
She's awesome.
And I was thinking about that, and like the harmless conspiracy theories, and like what I'm just like vibing with right now is just like this sense of curiosity of just like, if this is close enough that it could have ties, so if it does, what do those ties look like?
Mm-hmm.
And we're coming close to the end of our hour, but maybe I just want to ask, like, how do you stay curious when you're writing, especially on like the hard writing days, or maybe you have no hard writing days?
But I definitely do have hard writing days.
So how does curiosity drive you?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know exactly. I think that you have to be curious in life, whether or not you're a writer. And if you're not curious, I'm worried about you a little bit. But when it comes to writing days and curiosity and how that all meshes together, I think, being curious means you're open, because you're still willing to ask questions. Now, I don't mean question everything. You see that thrown around a lot. Question everything. Okay, sounds great, but sometimes you just need to be like, this is the truth. This is a fact. So I'm going to accept it and move on. But then there are these gray areas, and there's so many of them. It's like, why get hung up on debating facts when there's an ocean of gray for you to explore and be curious about. But how it pertains to writing is sort of like, when I have hard writing days, it's usually because I've made a mistake somewhere and I've painted myself into a corner kind of creatively. Something doesn't feel right, and it's like such a weird subconscious feeling that that's the writer's block. It's not that I can't think of sentences or way to describe things or a thing a character should say. It's that I know I shouldn't waste time doing it because I've gone off the rails, and I need to go back and figure out where and then fix it, and then it'll all come. The curiosity is being that openness, is being able to look back at what I've done and be open to the idea of questioning it, changing it, deleting it, whatever, or introducing a new idea, or allowing a new idea that's not even, maybe I'm not even thinking as a writer. Maybe I'm just decompressing and watching a movie, and then suddenly, but I am open. Something will happen in the story that will inspire a thought in me that, oh, that's what I need to do, and all the pieces fall together. I think just being open, being curious is in and of itself like a cure for a lot of these hurdles that we face, because it allows you not to treat everything as so precious that you can't break it if you have to look at the yoke and figure out if it's going to work or not. I think it would be unfair of me to mention for her memory that during the writing of this book, my wife and I had a daughter, and she passed away. That was a big hurdle to overcome for obvious reasons. It's not that I felt like I was going to walk away from writing or anything like that, but I certainly did struggle for a long time to find the focus to write. But it was the openness and the curiosity that helped me again find the ability to put words back on the page, because I was able to be open with myself and ask myself, like, it's this book is not me processing the loss of my daughter, but there are pieces of the story where characters are processing loss that are 100% me examining and asking myself about those thoughts and emotions, and it works its way into the story. And then in later drafts, it gets peeled back some, it gets dialed back some, because this isn't the space for that necessarily, but it has to be there in order for me to be sincere as a writer. But oh yeah, my wife just texted me to say also that I have a bumper sticker on my car that says "Curiosity drives us forward." So there you go. With the Mars rover.
I love that. That's with Mars rover. That's so clever. Thank you for that. We're coming to the end of our conversation, but I just wanted to thank you for everything, all the wisdom that you've shared with us, the curiosity, the openness, and I also wanted to just give a shout out, like, congratulations, this won a Best Indie Book Award recently. So congratulations on all your hard work and everything that you've been doing.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. I am going to go ahead and close the recording. I just want to thank everyone so much for being here, coming to hear Dylan read and hear his wisdom for this discussion. And
thanks for coming. Hey, Renee. Hey, Alex. Good to see you. Basement buddy. Hey, Tamara. Connor. What's up, dude? Miranda. And Brian. Hey, Brian. And then Pixel XL, whoever you are, Pixel XL. Sean, good to see you. Lynn, say hi to Matt. OJ.
thank you so much, everyone.